Hello, Modern World History students. We're continuing with Unit 9B, the end of the Cold War and its consequences. And this is Section 10, the disintegration of Yugoslavia. So you know now that one of the impacts of Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership of the Soviet Union is that Soviet troops finally pulled out of Eastern Europe. They had been placed there at the end of World War II. It was promised by Joseph Stalin at the Yalta Conference that they would be gone, that they would be withdrawn by the end of the year 1946. Of course, that didn't happen. And as a matter of fact, it didn't happen until 1989 when Mikhail Gorbachev finally removed those soldiers. What that led to then was essentially the collapse of communism all across Eastern Europe, in Poland, in East Germany, where the Berlin Wall came down and East and West Germany were reunited, in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, two states which had had the Soviet army crush uprisings against communism in previous decades, and in Romania as well, where things got violent. So there was this sweeping change happening all across Eastern Europe with the collapse of communism starting in 1989. This ultimately also affected Yugoslavia. Now, Yugoslavia was slightly different. It was one of the states which had effectively liberated itself from the Germans. Soviet troops did not drive Germans out of Yugoslavia, and as a matter of fact, Soviet troops never did actually occupy Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia was in a slightly different situation than the other countries of Eastern Europe. It was, however, a communist country, but the communism of Yugoslavia was a sort of a homegrown communism, not imposed upon them by the Soviet Union like so many of the other Eastern European countries, but more homegrown. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But what happened after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe is that communism also sort of fell apart in Yugoslavia, and that led to a series of bloody civil wars between Bosnians, Croats, and Serbs, three distinct nations who had made up part of Yugoslavia. So that's what this lesson is about, trying to understand and explain why all that happened. You'll be introduced to Marshal Josip Tito, President Slobodan Milosevic. You'll hear about the Croatian and Bosnian Wars of Independence, ethnic cleansing, and finally the Dayton Accords, which brought an end to all of this. So I'm starting you off on page 15, and we're gonna start on the left-hand side here. So you can find Yugoslavia relative to these other countries in Europe on the map. So on your map, you know, we've talked about Germany. Here's Czechoslovakia. Here's Hungary. Here's Romania. Here's Bulgaria. All of those states had been occupied, as well as Poland, by the way, here. All of those states had been occupied by Soviet troops at the end of World War II. Yugoslavia, which you'll find here, and you'll notice that on your map, it's broken up into these independent states. That was what happened. That's what's going to happen as a result of our story today. It will be broken up into all these little states. But at the beginning of our story, all of those are united into this single state called Yugoslavia. And as I mentioned, at the end of World War II, it was not occupied by Soviet troops. Its story is a little bit different. So if you haven't already done so, take a moment, pause the video if you like, and add Yugoslavia to your map, as well as these other countries if you haven't already done that. All right, so as I mentioned, Yugoslavia was formed in the years, at the very end of World War I. So I'm taking you back to the end of World War I here. Yugoslavia literally means land of the South Slavs, land of the South Slavs. And there are multiple Slavic nations. Now remember that to say you are Slavic is to say that your nation speaks a language that originates from this sort of root Slavic language. We talked about how in the world we find language groups. Groups of languages that are related to each other because they originate from a sort of a common root language. And so Slavic nations are nations whose languages originate in Slavic. They have similar languages, and in many cases their cultures are similar, but not the same. And so Slavic nations are independent or sort of distinct, culturally distinct nations, which are, however, sort of related to each other through their language. So remember that prior to World War I, there was this spirit of pan-Slavism, the idea that all the Slavic nations were sort of brothers, or at least cousins, and that they should stick together and stand up for each other and fight for each other. And that's the reason, for example, why Russia supported Serbia in its war against Austria-Hungary, which then grew into the First World War. So the spirit of pan-Slavism, the idea that all of the Slavs were related to each other and that they should stick together, that continued to hold up even through the end of the war. So that by the end of the war, the idea of having each Slavic nation become its own separate independent state um, was an idea that was promoted, for example, by President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Remember that President Wilson believed that each nation ought to have its own state. He believed that self-determination, giving each nation its own state, would help to prevent future instances of nationalism causing war, nationalism, each nation wanting its own state. So Wilson's attitude was give each nation its own state. But remember that the British and the French were worried because the Slavic nations were small nations and not really very united, although at the time they were. But they were small, and the British and French feared that if you gave them each their own state, then Europe would be made up of all these tiny little states that would be very vulnerable to invasion, particularly by Germany, who was Britain and France's favorite boogeyman, right? So the British and French proposed instead that the Slavic nations sort of join together to form a single state that would be larger and stronger and more capable of protecting itself. And at the time, the Slavic nations were sort of okay with that because this spirit of pan-Slavism still prevailed. The idea that the Slavic nations were all related to each other and should all stick together and should all support each other. So at the end of World War I, when the Empire of Austria-Hungary disintegrated, instead of all of its Slavic nations getting their own states, instead they were sort of globbed together to form this thing called Yugoslavia, land of the South Slavs. And that's what you're seeing here, all right? Each color represents one of the different nations that composed Yugoslavia, and this whole thing here is what became this new country called Yugoslavia at the end of World War I. And again, at the time, the Slavs were supportive of it. The various Slavic nations were supportive of it because the spirit of pan-Slavism was so strong at the time. Now, Yugoslavia continued to be this independent, self-governing state all the way up into World War II. During World War II, the Germans invaded and occupied Yugoslavia. And the resistance to the German invasion was led by the nation of people called the Serbs. The Serbs, led by Josip Broz Tito, who was himself not a Serb, but he was kind of the leader and organizer of the resistance to the Germans. And they fought the Germans really quite well. Yugoslavia is quite a mountainous, portions of it anyway, are quite mountainous. That made it very difficult for the Germans to move their soldiers around and fight the resistance. And the Yugoslav resistance was really very effective in making it a very, very difficult occupation for the Germans. And when the war was over, Tito sort of having led the resistance, he then took over and became the leader of Yugoslavia. Now, Tito himself was a communist. And as a result of that, Yugoslavia became a communist country after World War II, which makes it sort of unusual because most of the other countries of Eastern Europe became communist after World War II because Soviet troops had moved in and had occupied those countries, and because Joseph Stalin then had installed Soviet or communist dictators there, and Soviet troops were there to kind of prop those dictators up. That's how most of the countries of Eastern Europe became communist. That's not true of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia became communist because the man, Tito, who had led the resistance to the Germans pretty successfully, took over the country after the war, and he was a communist. So Yugoslavia became communist sort of more as a sort of a homegrown. It was more of a homegrown communism rather than imposed by the Soviet Union. So that's sort of his story. And Tito ruled Yugoslavia then until his death in 1980. Until 1980, Tito ruled Yugoslavia. So he ruled Yugoslavia for 35 years, roughly. And he ruled Yugoslavia much in the same way that Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union. I mean, he had a secret police to help him root out anybody who was kind of potentially an opponent or a rival. He maintained labor camps where his potential rivals just sort of disappeared and never came back. But while he acted like Stalin in his control over Yugoslavia, he did not cooperate with Stalin or any of the other Soviet leaders who came after Stalin because he was not occupied by Soviet troops, because Yugoslavia was not occupied by Soviet troops. He could sort of do this. He could be an independent. He could be a sort of a maverick. And so, for example, Yugoslavia never joined the Warsaw Pact. Never joined the Warsaw Pact. And Yugoslavia traded freely with capitalist countries, something that Stalin and the Soviets did not approve of. And so Stalin and the Soviets did not like Tito. Stalin even on occasion plotted to try to have Tito assassinated, murdered. Later Soviet leaders learned to live with him, but they didn't like him because he didn't do what they told him to do. He was a communist who sort of struck out on his own and did what he wanted to do. So he was kind of an interesting character, and he was a very interesting character. And Yugoslavia sort of charted its own course, a communist course, but not one under the domination of the Soviet Union, all the way up through the 1980s. Now, when he died, however, in 1980, there was no truly strong leadership who could replace him. And so, although Yugoslavia continued to sort of float along through the 1980s as a communist state, there was no leader who took over Yugoslavia who had the same kind of power and influence that Tito did. And so, really, momentum was holding Yugoslavia together, because Yugoslavia was really just about one of the most unnaturally created states in history. If Germany was unnaturally divided by the Cold War, it was unnatural that Yugoslavia even came together at all, much less that it held together for over 40 years. And here's why. Looking a little bit closer at this map, I said to you that I mentioned to you that Yugoslavia was made up of all these different Slavic nations at the end of World War I. So this map helps you to see all the different Slavic nations that were sort of combined together to form Yugoslavia. The largest group of people, the largest nation to help form Yugoslavia, was the nation of the Serbs. You see that they made up about 36% of the population of Yugoslavia. And all of the areas that you see on the map that are colored in pink are areas where the Serbs were in the majority. In those areas, Serbs were a majority. That is more than 50% of the population. The second largest group or nation that made up Yugoslavia were Croats. You can see that they made up around 20% of the population. And all the areas on the map that are colored in yellow, those are areas where the Croats were in the majority. The third largest group were what we call Bosnian Muslims. Bosnian Muslims made up about 9% of the population of Yugoslavia. And you can see the areas in green, which were home to a majority of Bosnian Muslims. And the fourth largest group were Slovenes, right? They made up about 8%. And the fifth largest group were Albanians. They made up about 8%. Now, I'm not going to go any farther than that because we can go and go and go with this, as you can see. The areas that are white on the map are areas where there was no majority. In other words, these are areas that were so ethnically diverse that no nation made up more than 50% of the population there. So there was no nation that was in the majority in those areas. And so you can see that the central part of Yugoslavia really has a lot of that, a lot of white areas where there's such great diversity. And you can see it, Serbs here, Bosnian Muslims here, Croats here, and then areas where there's no majority. And that's the way that a lot of Europe is. There's a lot of areas in Europe where nations of people, places that would be sort of borderlands between two nations, where they live mixed up amongst each other. There's no easy way to simply draw a line and say, okay, this is the area where the Serbs live, this is the area where the Croats live. We draw this nice little line here and we divide it up evenly. It's not like that. In many, many areas of Europe, particularly in this part of Europe, nations live mixed up amongst each other in communities. And so these areas of the map where you see white, those are areas where there is no majority. It's so diverse that no nation is in the majority. No nation is more than 50%. So that made for potential complications, particularly because the nations of Yugoslavia were so different from each other. They were all Slavs, meaning, yes, they all spoke languages that were related to each other, but their cultures, their ways of life were very different. So here are a couple examples. Starting up here in the Northwest, Slovenians and Croatians. Slovenians and Croatians are different from each other. They each speak their own language, but in some ways they're similar. They both, the majority of Slovenians and the majority of Croatians are Roman Catholic, right? They worship as Roman Catholics. So that's a form of Christianity. But what that also means is that Slovenia and Croatia were always more oriented toward Western Europe and more influenced by Western Europe. For one thing, because they were Roman Catholic, they were also influenced by the Latin language, which meant that their language was expressed using the Roman alphabet, the same alphabet that we use. So if you were in Slovenia or Croatia and you were looking at street signs or signs on businesses, you would at least recognize the letters. You might not understand the words, but you would at least recognize the letters. And because Slovenia and Croatia were more oriented toward Western Europe, more influenced by Western Europe, they experienced a lot of the things that the Western Europeans did, including the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution. And you can also see that the Slovenians and Croatians have a lot of coastline, so they had access to trade. And so what happened is that Slovenia and Croatia really developed modern economies based on trade, and finally, economies based on manufacturing. And as a matter of fact, I mentioned that during the time of Tito, Yugoslavia was trading with the capitalist countries. Most of the manufactured goods produced by Yugoslavia that they traded to the capitalist countries were produced in Slovenia and Croatia and exported out of ports in Slovenia and Croatia. So Slovenia and Croatia were a sort of more modern part of Yugoslavia. The eastern part of Yugoslavia, home to the Bosnian Muslims, the Serbs, the Montenegrins, the Albanians, the Macedonians, this is a more mountainous area and with less access to the sea. And as a result of that, these areas of Yugoslavia tended to fall behind in terms of development. They weren't oriented so much toward Western Europe. They were oriented more toward Eastern Europe. They had economies that were based more on agriculture, sort of farming and goat herding, rather than developing into modern economies based on manufacturing and trade. So most of the people of Eastern Yugoslavia were agricultural, a lot of herding, a lot of goat herding and that sort of thing, and farming. But they too were not all similar to each other. So for example, Serbs and Macedonians, they practice Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Eastern Orthodox Christianity, like Roman Catholicism, it's a form of Christianity, but it's led out of Greece and Turkey. The leadership is there rather than in Rome. And so they were practicing Christianity, but not the same form of Christianity as the Slovenians and the Croatians. Meanwhile, Bosnian Muslims and Albanians, they're Muslims. They practice Islam. They don't practice Christianity at all. And so they too were quite different. And of course, their languages will be influenced by Arabic, which is the language of Islam. Whereas, Serbian is a more traditionally Slavic language. Serbian language is expressed using what's called the Cyrillic alphabet, which is an alphabet that's similar to but not the same as the Roman alphabet. So if you were in Serbia and you were looking at street signs and business signs, you wouldn't necessarily recognize the letters, much less understand the words. So you can understand all these different nations that made up Yugoslavia were so different from each other. Um, way of life being very modern here in Slovenia and Croatia, more traditional here in Serbia and Montenegro and Bosnia and Albania and Macedonia, more traditional here. Roman Catholics here with a language more like that of Western Europe and more oriented toward Western Europe. Eastern Orthodox here with a language more similar to Eastern Europe. Muslims here practicing Islam. So really the various nations who were combined together to form Yugoslavia after World War I, they were nations that really didn't belong together. And the only thing they had in common was a language that was sort of based on that Slavic root language and that spirit of pan-Slavism, the idea that all the Slavic nations should stick together. And again, at the time, that spirit of pan-Slavism was strong enough that the various nations who formed Yugoslavia had some faith that they could stick together. And through the time of Tito's grip on that country was so strong, he ruled it in the same way that Stalin ruled the Soviet Union, that also held these nations together, kind of unnaturally. However, when Tito died, things began to fall apart. These nations were not only different from each other, but they had grievances against each other. So, for example, during World War II, when the Germans invaded, the Croatians became collaborators with the Germans. The Croatians worked with the Germans when the Germans invaded. The Serbs, I mentioned, were the base of resistance to the German occupation. So the Serbs were fighting against the Germans. They were leading the fight against the Germans. The Croats, or Croatians, they were collaborating with the Germans. And as a matter of fact, during World War II, there were concentration camps, right, operated by the Germans. And the Croatians assisted the Germans in rounding up the Serbs and transporting them to concentration camps, because the Serbs were Slavic people, and since they were also resisting Germany, the Germans, of course, wanted them exterminated, and the Croats collaborated with the Germans to assist the Germans in rounding up the Serbs and sending them to the concentration camps to be exterminated. The Serbs then, of course, were fighting back. So during World War II, there was this increasing not just rivalry, but hatred between Croats and Serbs that was exacerbated. It was made worse by the German occupation. Tito, after the war, was able to sort of force these two nations to cooperate with each other and at least behave and not fight each other. But they didn't like each other, obviously. Not just because they were culturally different, which they were, but because of this additional history that happened during World War II. But while Tito led Yugoslavia, and while Yugoslavia was a communist country, a lot of the wealth in Yugoslavia was being generated here. It was being generated in Slovenia and Croatia. They had the economies that were more modern, based on trade, based on manufacturing, and so the wealth was being generated here. Whereas not a lot of wealth was being generated here in these more traditional areas that were more based on herding, sort of older type economies. But because it was a communist country, Tito was taking the wealth that was being created here in Slovenia and Croatia and was redistributing it. He was using that wealth to support the people in the other parts of Yugoslavia. That's how communism works. You spread the wealth around to create a level of equality. Well, if wealth is being generated here and not generated here in a communist country, what do? You take some of the wealth here and you move it here. And so Slovenians and Croatians came to resent that. They resented the fact that they were generating the wealth and then that it was being redistributed to other parts of Yugoslavia. So when Tito died, there was already the beginnings of sort of rumblings that Yugoslavia could fall apart. And then when communism began to collapse across Eastern Europe, those rumblings became real, all right? As the various nations of Yugoslavia sort of began to see themselves again as independent nations, separate nations, unique nations that deserved self-government, rather than to continue to be under the control of this bigger state called Yugoslavia. Not surprisingly, the first two nations to declare themselves independent from Yugoslavia as communism began to fall all across Europe, right? In 1989, 1990, as the communist leaders began to fall all across Europe, that spirit of independence, that spirit of change made its way into Yugoslavia as well. And so some of the Yugoslavian nations, some of the nations that had formed Yugoslavia, began to think of themselves now as nations that should be free and independent, self-governing nations, not part of this bigger state anymore. And the first two nations to declare themselves independent, not surprisingly, were Slovenia and Croatia, because those two were so different from the rest of Yugoslavia. They were modern. They had these modern economies, and they felt really put upon by the way that Yugoslavia had been taking the wealth that they had generated and then shipping it off to other parts of Yugoslavia. And so they declared themselves independent. They want to be independent, self-governing states. They don't want to be part of Yugoslavia anymore. Now, when Slovenia declared itself independent, the rest of Yugoslavia was kind of like, whatever. Because as you can see, Slovenia is almost entirely made up of Slovenians. There are no areas of Slovenia where there are significant numbers of other nations living there. Certainly no areas of Slovenia where other nations are in the majority. Croatia is a different story. So these are the borders of Croatia. Croatia is a very odd-shaped state or country, right? It has the shape almost of a letter C for Croatia. See? Maybe a way to help you remember that and find it on the map. Croatia is sort of almost shaped like a letter C. And you can see that most of Croatia is majority Croatian. But there are areas of Croatia where the Serbs are in the majority. And of course, there are areas of Croatia here in the east and here in the center where there is no majority at all because the diversity is so great. So when Slovenia declared itself independent, no big reaction. But when Croatia declared itself independent, there was a significant reaction. And that reaction was led by Slobodan Milosevic. Slobodan Milosevic was the president of Yugoslavia. He had taken over after Tito had died. And Milosevic was a Serb, which made a certain amount of sense since the largest population of Yugoslavs were Serbs. It made a certain amount of sense that the president of Yugoslavia would be a Serb. But as president of Yugoslavia, he objected to Croatia's declaration of independence. He really didn't like the fact that Slovenia had left either, but he wasn't quite as stirred up by it. But if Croatia now also declared independence, Yugoslavia would lose both of its wealth-generating states, right? Both parts of Yugoslavia that were generating wealth would now be independent and would no longer be contributing to the wealth of Yugoslavia. But more importantly, as a Serb, Milosevic objected to the fact that when Croatia declared itself independent, that would mean that these Serb populations living in these white and pink areas would now be separated from Yugoslavia, and they would now be living as a minority in a country dominated by Croats, and with a government dominated by Croats. And so when Croatia declared its independence, Milosevic stated that he encouraged the Serbs in these areas of Croatia where they lived. He encouraged them to rise up in rebellion against the new Croatian government. So Croatia declares themselves independent. They have a government of their own. Milosevic, the president of Yugoslavia, and a Serb himself, encouraged the Serbs who were living in these areas of Yugoslavia to now rebel, launch violent rebellion against the new government of Croatia. And as a matter of fact, then, when the Serbs did rebel against the Croatian government, he then assisted them. The Yugoslavian army assisted these Serbs. The Serbs who were in rebellion against Croatia's government were then assisted by the army of Yugoslavia. ordered by Milosevic to do this, in what became known as the Croatian War of Independence. And the Croatian War of Independence lasted, 3 years, maybe 2.5 years. And it was the government of Croatia and the Croatian people versus Serbs living in Croatia, assisted by the army of Yugoslavia. It was called the Croatian War of Independence. And the Croatians won. The Croats won, and Croatia did become an independent country. But only after 25,000 people were killed, and 500,000 people became homeless, lost their homes, became displaced. But that was nothing compared to what happened when then Bosnia and Herzegovina declared their independence. So Milosevic was definitely, he was not willing to simply let Croatia go in peace, because you can see that there were these, Serb populations living in Croatia. But look at Bosnia. When Bosnia then declared their independence from Yugoslavia, this is really going to be outrageous to Milosevic, because you can see there are large sections of Bosnia where the Serbs are in the majority. They're separated from the rest of Serbia, yet these are areas where Serbs are in the majority, and there are other large sections of Bosnia where Serbs live, but there is no majority at all because there's so much diversity there. So Milosevic was pretty agitated when Croatia declared their independence. He was upset about these Serbs who would now be stuck in Croatia. He was really angry when Bosnia declared their independence, because look, there's even more Serbs living there. In Bosnia, in these are the borders of Bosnia here. Okay, this is Sarajevo. You remember the city where Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, opening up World War I. So this area is Bosnia here, and you can see that there are Croats. There are areas of Bosnia where Croats are in the majority. There are areas of Bosnia where Serbs are in the majority. Of course, these areas are the areas where Bosnian Muslims are in the majority, and you have big sections where there's no majority at all. There's so much diversity. So Croatia gained their independence, but had to fight for it. And now Bosnia declared their independence as well. As a nation of Muslims, they preferred to rule themselves rather than continuing to be part of Yugoslavia, undoubtedly dominated by Serbs. So now Bosnia declared their independence. Once again, Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Yugoslavia, what was left of Yugoslavia, he now encouraged these Serbs living in these areas, okay, in the areas where Serbs are in the majority, and Serbs living in the areas where it's so diverse that there is no majority, just as he did when Croatia declared their independence. Milosevic again encouraged Serbs living in these areas to rise up against the government of Bosnia and rebel against them. And once again, he provided support to them. The Yugoslav army and Air Force provided support to them in their war against the new Bosnian government. To make things even more difficult for the Bosnians, you see that there's this area of Bosnia that was a Croat majority. Croatians in that area, or Croats in that area, also rose up in rebellion against the Bosnian government. They were supported by the government of Croatia. So, the Croatian War of Independence was somewhat clean, in as much as it's the new government of Croatia versus Serbs who are rebelling against them, supported by Yugoslavia. Bosnia is a straight up mess. This Bosnian War of Independence was truly devastating, because it was the new government of Bosnia versus, on one hand, Croats rebelling against them with the support of the Croatian government, and Serbs rebelling against them with the support of the Yugoslavian government and the Yugoslavian army and air force. And this war went on for 8 years. The Bosnian War of Independence went on for 8 years, and it was brutal. It was brutal. It was chaotic. The city of Sarajevo became this full-blown battleground, because if you may have noticed that Sarajevo is fully located inside this area where the diversity is so great that there's no majority. You've got an area just outside Sarajevo that's majority Serb. You've got an area just outside Sarajevo that's majority Croat. You've got areas just outside Sarajevo that are majority Muslim, Bosnian Muslim. But Sarajevo itself is an area where the diversity is so great, where these groups mix together so much that there's no majority at all. So the city of Sarajevo became this battleground, at times surrounded by forces that were Serb forces, the city effectively under siege, but the city itself divided up amongst the different sides that were fighting each other. That siege of Bosnia, wherein the forces of the Serbs, supported by the Yugoslav Army and Air Force, that siege of Sarajevo actually lasted longer even than the siege of Leningrad. It was not as devastating in terms of loss of life, but it lasted even longer than the siege of Leningrad, became one of the longest sieges in history. Meanwhile, inside the city, people tried to go about their work. They tried to go to work each day and maintain the life of the city. But in the midst of going to work, firefights would break out between the Bosnian army and militias of Serb, pro-Serb militias, pro-Croat militias. And oftentimes civilians would be caught in the crossfire like this, forced to sort of take cover while Bosnian army forces protected them and Serb militias tried to attack. I mean, it was a chaotic time in the city of Sarajevo and throughout Bosnia. It was also a period in which ethnic cleansing took place. So I mentioned that you have these areas of Bosnia where there are Serb majorities. In those areas, the Serbs, remember, they're in the majority, right? That doesn't mean that there are no other people living there. In a lot of the areas where there were Serb majorities, there were a large number of Bosnian Muslims living there as well. And during the Civil War, after Bosnia declared itself independence, what the Serbs living here wanted to do, of course, is they wanted to clear out all the Bosnian Muslims. After all, the whole objection to Bosnia declaring its independence was these Serbs who were living here, these Serbs, they did not want to live under control of a government that was run by the Bosnians. They would rather still be part of Yugoslavia. So ethnic cleansing is where you try to cleanse out, clear out all of the people of a different ethnic group from yours, okay? So in all of these areas of Bosnia where the Serbs were in the majority, they tried to cleanse out the Bosnian Muslims so that those areas could then detach from Bosnia and then attach to Serbia to remain part of Yugoslavia, or perhaps to become part of some new non-Yugoslav state that was simply called Serbia. So what began to happen is, in all of these areas of Bosnia where there were Serb majorities, the Serb populations began to try to drive out the Bosnian Muslim populations. And it even went on a little bit here in the areas where the Croats were in the majority. They were trying to drive out the Bosnian Muslim populations as well. But most of the ethnic cleansing was taking place in the areas where the Serbs were in the majority. So the Serbs in those areas were trying to cleanse out the Bosnian Muslims so that those areas could become pure Serb areas and they could remain part of Yugoslavia or reattach to Yugoslavia or attach to Serbia or whatever. This involved, and this was also done with the support of the Yugoslavian army. So Slobodan Milosevic, the Serb leader of Yugoslavia, not only supported the Serbs in their military actions against the Bosnian government, but he also provided them support in their ethnic cleansing of the Bosnian Muslim populations in the Serb-dominated areas. They established concentration camps, as you see here. Hundreds of thousands of Bosnian Muslims were placed in these concentration camps. And while these camps didn't necessarily take on the quality of Hitler's extermination camps, certainly tens of thousands of Bosnian Muslims died in these camps simply because of the poor conditions of the camps. There were also cases where populations of Bosnian Muslims were simply rounded up and murdered, mass murdered, machine gunned. by the forces of the Serbs, either by the forces of the Serbian militias or the Yugoslav army supporting the Serbs. The most notable case of this sort of massacre is near a town called Srebrenica, where a mass grave was opened up, revealing the dead bodies of 8,000 Bosnian Muslims who were simply murdered in an act of ethnic cleansing by the Serbs. So finally, especially when more and more evidence of this sort of genocide or ethnic cleansing against the Bosnian Muslims became obvious, the United Nations and NATO became involved. And the United States, being the lead member of NATO, began a military campaign against Yugoslavia to punish Yugoslavia for its role in making the Bosnian War of Independence more deadly. Clearly, Slobodan Milosevic, the leader of Yugoslavia, had first of all encouraged that war to break out in the first place, encouraging the Serb populations to rebel against the new Bosnian government. He had also made the conditions there so much worse by contributing Yugoslav army and air force to the fight on the side of the Serbs, and he had clearly encouraged the ethnic cleansing of Bosnian Muslims, including the establishment of camps and these mass murders. And so the United Nations and NATO effectively declared war on Yugoslavia, and U.S. forces, leading NATO forces, bombed Yugoslav army and air force bases in order to make it more difficult for the Yugoslavs to assist the Serbs. At the same time, the United Nations put pressure on Yugoslavia to negotiate an end to the war, and that negotiation actually took place here in Ohio, in Dayton, at the big Air Force base in Dayton. And ultimately, there was a peace treaty negotiated which brought an end to the Bosnian War of Independence. Bosnia is now an independent state, but the cost of that was 100,000 people were killed in the Bosnian War of Independence, and 2.5 million people were driven out of their homes. Many of them Bosnian Muslims who had been ethnically cleansed, moved out of their homes by the Serbs. There was more fighting later in Yugoslavia, but we're sort of running out of time, and I think that's the essence of the story. Today, there is no Yugoslavia. Serbia simply eventually declared that what was left of Yugoslavia was Serbia. Montenegro became independent. It's an independent state. Macedonia became independent. So Yugoslavia as a state no longer exists. It probably never should have existed because the nations which were globbed together to form it were really so different from each other. But Yugoslavia as a state no longer exists, and unfortunately, the process of the disintegration of Yugoslavia was a bloody and violent process that continued throughout the 1990s. All right, so that's all for this lesson. I hope you are doing well, and I look forward to teaching you again soon. Take care, Modern World History students. So long.